So I just want to read from Genesis 11. Beginning at verse 27, and it says, "Now these are the generations of Terah. Terah fathered Abram, Nahor and Haran fathered Lot. Haran died in the presence of his father Terah in the land of his kindred, in Earle of the Chaldees. And Abram and Nahor took wives. The name of Abram's wife was Sarah. The name of Nahor's wife, Milcah, the daughter of Haran, the father of Milcah and Iscah. Now Sarah was barren, she had no child. Terah took Abram his son, and Lot the son of Haran his grandson, and Sarai his daughter-in-law, his son Abram's wife, and they went forth together from Ur of the Chaldeans to go into the land of Canaan. But when they came to Haran, they settled there. The days of Terah were 205 years, and Terah died in Haran." Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I'll show you. And I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonours you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarah his wife, and Lot his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people that they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan. And when they came to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh, and at that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved to the hill country on the east of Bethel and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and called upon the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on, still going toward the Negev. Often when people are looking at the story of Abram's call, they start in chapter 12. It seems like a natural moment because that's the moment when God begins to speak to Abraham and begins to give him the command. But actually, the story really starts back in 11. Because what we see is that Terah had taken his family and had begun that journey. We don't know why he had begun that journey, but he'd begun that journey, and his intention was to go to Canaan. But he stopped in Haran. So we'll take a look at what was going on there and why. It seems it's about getting back on plan. First of all, you have Adam after the fall. Then you have Noah after the flood. And Terah after the flop. Yes, Babel was a flop. It was a plan of man to try and do something for himself, to make a name for himself on the earth. But what man failed to do for himself, God did for Abram. And these three men, Adam, Noah and Terah, seem to be fairly key at key points in time. It's interesting how these patterns keep emerging. Because when we look at these three, what we find that each of them had 3 sons. Adam had the 3 sons of Cain, Abel and Seth, and God chose Seth to take the journey on. Noah had 3 sons, Shem, Ham and Japheth, and he chose Shem to take the journey on. And then Terah had Abram, Nahor and Haran, and chose Abram. 3, 3 and 3, choosing 1, 1 and 1. And isn't it interesting also to note that Noah was the 10th in line, the 10th generation from Adam. And Terah was the 10th generation from Noah. And so you see these patterns keep appearing. So let's just take a look at this family tree for a moment, because it gets very interesting, and unless you analyse it and look at it closely, you can kind of miss something of what has happened in this. So Terah has 3 sons, Abram, Nahor and Haran. And we're going to start at the right, and we're going to start looking at Haran. Haran had 2 daughters, Milcah and Iscah, and 1 son called Lot. And Milcah marries her uncle, Nahor. They produce a son, Bethuel. He has a son and daughter, Laban and Rebekah. And Laban has 2 daughters, Rebekah and Leah. And then Abraham, as we know, he has a son by Hagar, Ishmael. And Abraham also, finally, after a long wait, has a son by Sarah, Isaac. And Abraham is sent back. He's gone back to the old country in order to find a wife for Isaac. So Isaac marries Rebekah, which means that they both have Terah as their forefather. And Isaac and Rebekah have 2 children, Esau and Jacob. And Jacob goes back to the old country and he marries Rachel and Leah. And then they wonder why they're having difficulty having children. The inbreeding is amazing. But there's another little bit of inbreeding which we often also don't quite notice, because Abraham goes to Egypt. In fact, it's the next thing that happens in the story. And as he goes into Egypt, he says to her, "Look, you're a very attractive woman. For my personal safety, please, can you say that you're not my wife, but that you're my sister?" And so word of her beauty gets to Pharaoh. Pharaoh takes her into his household. The next minute there's all kinds of plagues and problems starting to happen there. And Pharaoh realises that there's something wrong. God has obviously communicated something to him. And so he comes back to Abraham and gives Sarah back and basically asks him to take her away. But then the same thing happens later with Abimelech. And again, he is accused, and Abraham says this in his defence. He says, actually, she is my sister. She's the daughter of my father, but she's not the daughter of my mother. So what you actually see here is that Terah obviously had another relationship with somebody else, and that Sarah was actually Abraham's stepsister. So there's lots of these closed loops in here. And I sometimes wonder whether God was wanting to kind of like, let's just split this up a bit. Let's just get these guys out of here. And I think perhaps God had, in some way, spoken to Terah so that he had inspired in him the desire to move and had even put it in Terah's mind that he should go to Canaan. Because that's what we're told was the original intention, that Terah had gathered up his family and had decided to go to Canaan. Now, although this is not particularly distinct on here, there is what is called the Levant. And it's a green area that runs from Babylon, it curves up towards Turkey, and then comes down on the east coast of the Mediterranean where Israel is. And in the middle is a bit of a desert. It's a bit of a dry area. And so if they're going to make that journey, they have to do the loop over and down. And so they'd set off, and they'd set off really from from Babel's base camp, from Babylon. And they'd set off from there, and then they'd stopped in this place, Haran. And the first thing you might notice is that Haran is the same name as Terah's son, who had died while still back in Ur or Babylon. I think it's quite possible, especially with what happens next, I think it's quite possible that actually the town was named after his son. This happened a lot in the area. In fact, if you look at the genealogy between Noah and Terah, what you see is people who've got names who later on become nations. One of them, for example, is called Egypt, and he becomes a nation in his own right. And this naming of towns and cities after people is not unusual. It continued to happen right on up to the time of Christ. And we see cities like Antioch, that was named after Antiochus. We see cities like Caesarea or Caesarea, that were named after Caesar. Even Laodicea, that was actually named after one of the wives of Antiochus. And so these cities become named after people, either living or dead. And I think Terah, I just get this sense here that the man stopped, named a place after his dead son, and I think just kind of lost heart in terms of going any further. He decided to settle and remain in a place that was named after a dead son. And it's after Terah had died here in Haran that God then said to Abram, "Go from your country, your kindred, and your father's house to the land that I will show you." So there's three levels here. Country, go from your country, go from this place, separate yourself totally from the country. Leave your kindred behind, although he didn't, he took Lot with him. And leave your father's house. Those are quite big issues. Abraham actually has to give up everything that he holds dearest for an unknown land promised by God, because God doesn't tell him to go to Canaan. He tells him, go from this place to a land I will show you. And so Abraham doesn't actually know where yet, but he sets off and actually continues the journey that his father had started. And so they leave Haran, and Haran is still there today, by the way. It's a city in Turkey. And a number of our people have been there. But there is another town nearby called Nahor that's named after the third son. Terah's third son. And so Abraham comes in and he actually walks the full length of the land, the whole length of Canaan, and passes out the other side. And he camps at several places that it's specifically stated. He probably camped at a lot more, but the places that are stated are Shechem, a place between Bethel and Ai, and then he goes on down towards the Negev desert, and then finally goes on into Egypt. He's entered the northern border, and walks all the way to the southern border. So while he's still in Haran, God has spoken to him and given him a number of promises before he makes the move. He says, I will make of you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. God is speaking about the formation of a nation. I will make you a great nation. He's talking about effectively the making of a king. Abraham, although he's not named as king, he's listed in the line of the kings in Matthew. The descendancy there, going all the way from Joseph, all the way back through the line of the kings, and goes on back and stops at Abraham. Because effectively, he is like the first king. He is being made the head of this new nation that God is promising. He also says, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who dishonour you. In you all families of the earth shall be blessed. And it's interesting that we've heard a blessing like this in other places. We hear Isaac brings this blessing for Jacob when he comes towards the end of his life, and he blesses each of his sons. And he says, those who bless you shall be blessed. Those who curse you shall be cursed. And then later on, Balaam's blessing, he's speaking the words of God, and he speaks of Israel. Blessing, they will be blessed. Cursed, they will be cursed. It's only in this blessing to Abraham that God personalises it. I will do this. Thereafter, it's treated as though it's a statement of fact. Anybody who does this, either blesses or cursed, they themselves will be blessed or cursed. And that's a blessing that still holds true today. I actually worry about people who curse Israel, people who deny Israel's position, because they're actually speaking against Israel. And those curses, those blessings and curses still happen today. There's also a kind of progression of blessings as well. Look how they get bigger. First of all, God says, you will be blessed. Just Abraham. That's the first blessing. Then God expands that in his next line. Your name will be used as a blessing. It expands up slightly. Those who bless Abraham will be blessed. It gets bigger. And ends with this idea that all families on the earth will be blessed through Abraham. The other thing we have in this account is that this is the first time, apart from the garden, because I believe that God appeared to Adam and Eve, and I believe that they saw him and they communed with him. But after the fall, this is the first time that God actually appears to somebody. That's the words that are used there. He appeared to Abraham. And often, when we have the idea of God in some form presenting himself, in the before Christ, BC, they're usually referred to as theophanies. That is a manifestation of the physical presence of God. And AD, we tend to talk in terms of Christophanies, the manifestation of Christ. And that still happens today. We were actually watching a testimony yesterday about a man a Jewish man, who had come to that moment where he had realised who Jesus was, and he was just praying in his room about this. And he looked up, and Jesus was standing in the room with him. And he knew that this was a divine presence, that it was God. He knew that this was Jesus. He was not in any fear of what he was seeing. But I think actually that all of these appearances, I think, actually are Christ. In fact, a lot of theologians talk about the fact that when the Old Testament refers to the Lord of hosts or the angel of the Lord, many theologians believe that that is a name or a description of a pre-incarnate Christ who has presented himself. And so I start to wonder whether, in fact, all of these manifestations that appear in the Old Testament are actually Christophanies, that they are pre-incarnate versions of Christ. He hasn't yet come in human and flesh form, but nevertheless represents himself looking like a man. I believe that that's who Jacob wrestled with at the well. I believe that various other places where there is a direct encounter with one who is often referred to as the angel of the Lord or the commander of the Lord's hosts. I believe that where there is that embodiment of something that they're seeing as a man, that this is actually Christ interacting. And I'm going to develop that a little bit further in a later teaching, because it's very interesting that Jesus, when he's talking with some others, at one point they say to him with this whole business of I am, because Jesus says, before Abraham was, I am. Like, how can you say this? You're not even 30 years old. And yet, you're saying, and Jesus then compounds that by saying, Abraham saw my day. Abraham saw me. And so I believe that there is a moment where very, very much defines Abraham meeting Jesus and actually knew him, actually met him, actually had a direct encounter. We'll come up with that on a later teaching, and I'll go through that. But after he had made that move, after he had chosen to leave Haran and leave his family, he goes and does as he is told. And he walks through the land that God will later say, that's the land I'm going to give you. That's the land I'm going to give you. And he then says, God then says to him, and this is another promise now after Abraham. So he stepped out in faith. And then God gives this promise. To your offspring, I will give this land. So who are we talking about when we talk about this offspring? Because what is interesting is that this has come up in this passage. It's come up in verse 7 in this passage. But God still hasn't actually said what land he is giving him. To your offspring, I will give this land. And do you know who he's talking about? He's talking about Jesus. Because if we look at the word that was used in there, Lozeraka, to your seed. A few weeks ago I was talking about in Noah that there's this word Lamech, the name of Lamech, that some people have said it's not Mech, not despairing. And I said, when you put this letter on at the beginning, remember the right hand side, the one in white, when you just stick that letter on to the beginning of the word, it means to or for something. And so here in the Hebrew is saying, I'm going to give this to, or I'm going to give it for your seed. Seed is Zerah, and your seed, the noun masculine singular, ends, that verb, when it's speaking about your something, ends ka at the end. So, Lezeraka. So it's to your seed. It's only if it's low, if it has an aleph in there and it's got a little dash after the aleph, that it means not something. In fact, all of the Ten Commandments, they begin low with a little dash. Don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. And so it's to or for your seed, a singular seed. Notice it's a masculine singular. Now, if you're worried that if you didn't understand the Hebrew you wouldn't have picked up that point, actually we're told it in Galatians by Paul. Paul says the promises were made to Abraham and to his offspring. It does not say and to offsprings, plural, referring to many, but referring to one, and to your offspring, who is Christ. And so we've seen yet again another. It seems that we can't touch on a story in Genesis that doesn't have a message about Christ in it. He's there throughout. And as I say, we will come across a passage where I will show you that Abraham is sitting and having a conversation with Christ, having a very real encounter with him. And so there's this amazing promise that was made. It's the promise which the Jews never really fully understood. Here is this promise to the Gentile nations, to everybody, to the whole world, that somebody, this Messiah, is coming to bring a reconciliation to the whole world. God's plan. Several times here we've seen these periods where God's trying to pull it back online. But it's not quite happening. But he has a plan. He has a plan where ultimately he will win. You know, there's a story about a boy or a young man who was slightly backward, who one day comes into his church and says to the pastor there, I read the whole of the book of Revelation. And the pastor was quite impressed because it's a tough book, and he looked at the boy, and the boy wasn't a particularly bright boy. And he said, wow, you read the whole thing? So I said, yes. He said, did you understand it? Yes. Wow. What's it all about? And the boy said, God wins. God wins. God will win. He has a plan. He's brought along his Saviour, his Messiah, that was the plan all along. And one day, that Messiah, that Saviour is coming back again to wrap everything up. God wins. Amen.